My name is William McMichael. How is it that 631 men and women in New York State that were arrested at the ages of 16 and 17 still sit in prisons throughout New York State and are now in their 30s, 40s, and 50s? The answer is not only disturbing and sad, but shows how systematic racism exists within these United States. Because 85% of the 631 prisoners, myself included, are African American and Latino. In order to truly understand this injustice, we have to understand the dark and wicked history of the United States. W.E.B. Du Bois stated in the Black Reconstruction in America, the slave when free stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. Some will say, how is that if slavery was abolished in the United States? Well, when President Abraham Lincoln issued a declaration purporting to free slaves held in Southern Confederate states, not a single black slave was actually free to walk away from a master in those states as a result. A civil war had to be won first, hundreds of thousands of lives lost, and then and only there were slaves across the South set free. Constitutional amendments guaranteeing African Americans equal protection of the laws and the right to vote proved as impotent as the Emancipation Proclamation once a white backlash against Reconstruction gained steam. Black people found themselves yet again powerless and relegated to convict leasing camps that were in many ways worse than slavery. Sunshine gave way to darkness and a Jim Crow system of segregation emerged, a system that put black people nearly back where they began, in a subordinate racial caste. What is even more disturbing is the story that is told during Black History Month is one of triumph. The system of racial caste is officially dead and buried. Suggestions to the contrary are frequently met with shocked disbelief. The standard reply is, how can you say that a racial caste system exists today? Just look at Barack Obama and look at Oprah Winfrey. The fact that some African Americans have experienced great success in recent years does not mean that something akin to a racial caste system no longer exists. No case system in the United States has governed all black people. There have always been free blacks and black success stories, even during slavery and Jim Crow. The superlative nature of individual black achievement today in formerly white domains is a good indicator that the old Jim Crow is dead, but it does not necessarily mean the end of racial case. If history is any guide, it may have simply taken a different form, which leads me to the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, but allowed one major exception. Slavery remained appropriate as punishment for a crime. At this moment, that language still exists in the 13th Amendment, so anyone being held in a United States prison is legally a slave. Convicts have no meaningful legal rights at this time. We are literally slaves of the state. In a landmark decision by the Virginia Supreme Court, Ruffin versus Commonwealth, the court put to rest any notion that convicts were legally distinguishable from slaves. The court stated, for a time during his service in the penitentiary, it is in a state of penal servitude to the state. He has, as a consequence of his crime, not only forfeited his liberty, but all his personal rights, except those which the law in its humanity accords to him. He is, for the time being, a slave of the state. He is a civiliter mortis, and his estate, if he has any, is administered like that of a dead man. Therefore, once the 13th Amendment came into play, blacks were now viewed as menacing and dangerous. In fact, the current stereotypes of black men as aggressive, unruly predators can be traced to this period, when whites feared that an angry mass of black men might rise up and attack them or rape their woman. The 13th Amendment opened the door to the birth of mass incarceration. The rhetoric of law and order was first mobilized in the 1950s as Southern governors and law enforcement officials attempted to generate and mobilize white opposition to the civil rights movement. Beginning in the 1960s, crime rate rose in the United States for a period of about 10 years. Reported street crime quadrupled and homicide rates nearly doubled. Despite significant controversy over the accuracy of crime statistics during this period, the reasons for the crime wave are complex, but can be explained in large part by the rise of the baby boom generation, the spike in the number of young men in the 15 to 24 age group, which historically has been responsible for most crimes. The surge of young men in the population was occurring at precisely the same time that unemployment rates for black men were rising sharply. But the economic and demographic factors contributing to rising crime were not explored in the media. Instead, crime reports were sensationalized and offered as further evidence of the breakdown in lawfulness, morality, and social stability in the wake of the civil rights movement. To make matters worse, riots erupted in the summer of 1964 in Harlem and Rochester, followed by a series of uprisings that swept the nation following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. The racial imagery associated with the riots gave food to the argument that civil rights for blacks led to rampant crime. Cities like Philadelphia and Rochester were described as being victims of their own generosity. Conservatives argued that having welcomed blacks immigrating from the South, these cities were repaid with crime-ridden slums and black discontent. Barry Goldwater, in his 1964 presidential campaign, aggressively exploited the riots and fears of black crime, laying the foundation for the Get Tough on Crime movement that would emerge. As a result of that, the United States prison population went from 196,429 in 1970 to over 2 million today. We have the highest rate of prisoners in the world. It would take Russia and several other countries prison populations together to come close to the United States prison population. Majority of the U.S. prison population is black and Latino. In the 70s, African Americans and Latinos lacked college educations and had attended racially segregated, underfunded schools lacking basic resources. Those residing in ghetto communities were particularly ill-equipped to adapt to the changes taking place in the United States economy. They were left isolated and jobless. One study indicates that as late as 1970, more than 70% of all blacks working in metropolitan areas held blue-collar jobs. Yet by 1987, the year in which I was born, when the drug war hit high gear, the industrial employment of black men had plummeted to 28%. The new manufacturing jobs that opened during this time period were generally located in the suburbs. The growing spatial mismatch of jobs had a profound impact on African Americans trapped in ghettos. A study of urban black fathers found that only 28% had access to an automobile. The rate fell to 18% for those living in ghetto areas. Joblessness and crack swept inner cities precisely at the moment that a fierce backlash against the civil rights movement was manifesting itself through the war on drugs. No one should ever attempt to minimize the harm caused by crack cocaine and the related violence. David Kennedy summed it up best. Crack blew through America's poor black ghettos like the four horsemen of the apocalypse, leaving behind unspeakable devastation and suffering. As a nation, we had a choice about how to respond. Some countries faced with rising drug crime or seemingly intractable rates of drug abuse and drug addiction chose the path of drug treatment, prevention, and education or economic investment in crime-ridden communities. The United States did the opposite. They declared war on these crime-ridden communities. Now, with that said, the question I posed at the beginning of this speech, how is it that 631 men and women in New York State that were arrested at the ages of 16 and 17 still sit in prisons throughout New York State and are now in their 30s, 40s, and 50s? It is clear we were victims of systematic racism, and at no time during sentencing for our crimes were our psychological state, age, crime-ridden communities, single-parent homes, or experiences such as physical, verbal, or sexual abuse ever considered. We were treated as adults even though we were children. What's even more disturbing is we have a governor in New York State that stated we are relegating hundreds of teenagers each year, mostly young men of color, to an abusive prison environment that makes them more likely to commit crimes in the future. That is not only an injustice, it is an injustice that compromises public safety, and we must make a change. It's time for the legislature to raise the age. After he stated that 2 years later, New York State passed the Raise the Age bill, which stopped the court system from prosecuting 16 and 17-year-olds as adults. However, the state totally forgot about the 631 kids who were prosecuted under that 50-year injustice. So the injustice the governor was referring to still exists and will continue to exist at the cost of taxpayers. This year alone, taxpayers will spend an estimated $37.8 million to house all 631 of us. And if we remain in prison over the next 5 years, taxpayers will spend a disturbing $189 million. All because New York State failed to enact legislation to give us a meaningful opportunity and a meaningful life outside prison walls. Therefore, I have put together a petition with New York State Governor demanding that he commute all 631 of our sentences. So please join me in my fight against an injustice. The link to the petition can be found on my Facebook page at William J. McMichael, McMichael. I have a tan shirt on in my profile picture. We need 10,000 signatures to stop this injustice. So far, I've managed to come up with over 920 signatures. Every signature counts. I have reached out to numerous people, and a lot have not responded. This is my plea to the public for your assistance. Thank you for listening.